Hello friends, welcome back to my channel. My name is Kate, and today I'm going to be talking about the books that I read back in June for the Amazing Readathon. I know we are now in August, but I really wanted to talk about these books and what a fun time I had with the Readathon. If you're not familiar with it, Amazing Readathon is a readathon that's put on by Bree over at Four Paws in a Book. It's heavily based on the Amazing Race, if you're familiar with that, where you're sort of trying to race to different locations, and each leg of the race has a specific prompt and a specific city that it's associated with. In previous years, Bree has done actual cities, like in the world. This year, it was all cities from books, which was a super fun element. I honestly had a great time with that change. I think it was on the Lore Keepers team, but today I'm just going to go through each leg of the race, talk about what I initially picked. Several of them I DNF'd and picked up something else, but it's basically just a way for me to talk about what I ended up reading in the month of June. I am going to be changing to more of a recent reads format rather than the monthly wrap-ups because, as you can tell, I'm not that great at keeping up with a monthly cadence, and I think I just want to be able to talk about books as soon as I finish them. So I'm going to switch to that, maybe do quarterly rankings to do bigger picture of my reading, but that's a change you'll be seeing coming soon. So the first leg of the readathon for this year was The Emerald City from The Wizard of Oz, and for that we had to read a book with a green cover. And from the very beginning, I knew what I was going to pick for this one because June is Pride Month. I really wanted to start with a book with queer rep, so I ended up picking up The Sapling Cage by Margaret Killjoy. This is a YA coming-of-age fantasy trans girl who wants to become a witch, and it's sort of her journey as she figures that out. I really like that this is written by a trans woman. So you kind of get that own voices experience with it. What originally sold me on this book was actually a rec on Libro FM, which is one of the audiobook services. One of the booksellers on there had, and I'm going to read this because otherwise I'm going to get it wrong, had tagged it as perfect for anyone who loved Alana by Tamara Pierce, especially if you wondered how her brother Tom was doing, and especially if you wish that Tom was a trans girl. I love Song of the Lioness. It is hands down one of my favorite YA fantasy series ever. I was definitely that tomboy girl that wanted to go and be a knight, which is what you have in Alana, where the main character is going to be sent to a school for ladies and wants to be a knight, so she swaps places with her brother Tom. In The Sapling Cage, the main character is Laurel, who's a young trans girl who is only out to her mother and to her best friend. Her best friend wants to be a knight, but is promised to the witches, so she and Laurel swap spots, and Laurel goes off to learn to be a witch. I will say that The Sapling Cage is a darker fantasy story. Not that it has super gruesome content, but that the world itself is not particularly kind to witches. Witches are sort of being set up as these scapegoats for this magical blight that is starting to take over the forests of the world. And as Laurel is learning about the magic, she's also having to deal with witches being these scapegoats and being disliked for stuff that they are not doing. So I really loved that element. I loved Laurel as a main character. She's just very, very likable. She just wants to be a witch. She's fascinated by all of it. I loved learning the magic with her. I loved getting to see her sort of form bonds with the other girls in the group. And there's a bit of bullying that happens that they kind of have to navigate around. And I liked how Killjoy kind of made the girls figure that out for themselves and sort of build this community themselves. And I thought that was really well done. I really, really loved that. I will say that I think this is not Killjoy's first book, but there is a little bit of shakiness in the writing that makes me think of a debut author. There's some parts with the dialogue and some of the actions characters take that feel like they're not really true to those characters and feel a little forced to me. But that's really the only complaint I would have about this book. I think I ended up giving it 4.5 stars, just because, like I said, I really liked the magic. I'm not always sold on witch stories because a lot of times they feature witch trials, which just get really traumatic and messed up, and I hate them. I just can't read them. This was much more the witches fending for themselves and figuring out the culprits behind the blight. And I loved the world. I loved the way it weaved in these elements that did make me think very strongly of Song of the Lioness, in a really good way. So that comp doesn't always work for me, but I think this one is spot on. And if you like Song of the Lioness, I would highly recommend picking this one up. Leg number 2 was Basgiath's War College. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right because it's been a while since I read Fourth Wing and I did not do the audio, but obviously this is from Fourth Wing. And the prompt for this one was a violent word in the title. And I ended up picking up another YA fantasy. What's funny to me about June is that I often say that I don't really enjoy a lot of young adult romance anymore. Romance. I don't enjoy a lot of young adult fantasy anymore. I've kind of aged out of a lot of it. I just don't connect to the characters as often anymore. But I read a lot of YA fantasy for June, so maybe I'm completely wrong and I just have to find the right YA fantasy. I don't know. But anyway, I picked up a YA fantasy, The Last Bloodcarver by Vanessa Lay. This has been on my TBR for a long time. Well, I shouldn't say long time. For 2 years or so. I got the Owl Crate edition of this back in, I want to say it was 2024. The sequel came out this year, and I love these covers so much that I ended up picking up the sequel before I even read the first one, so I was desperately hoping that I would love this enough to justify having these books. Okay, so this is the Owl Crate edition. I will try not to make it too shiny for you guys. I freaking love this cover. I love the heart, all the foiling, and they did some amazing edges for it. It's just honestly one of my favorite special editions that I have. So I am super happy that I really ended up enjoying this one. Nika, who is one of the last magic users from her culture, her people were basically invaded, and her family fled to a neighboring country, and all of her family has passed away. So now just Nika trying to make her way through the world. The type of magic that she has is not outlawed necessarily in the country she's in, but it's not accepted. And it scares people because she has the ability, by touching people, she has the ability to manipulate their biology, and sort of their organs, and it's got a very medical feel to it. So it's not surprising that the author has a medical background, because it's really well done. It also has steampunk elements that I thought were really fascinating. So I really loved Nika as a character because she's super snarky, doing what it takes to survive. She's basically scraping by, sometimes doing illegal appointments, and she ends up getting dragged into this murder mystery with a very wealthy, very powerful family, who essentially purchase her. And there's this really interesting dynamic between them because they really want her help in solving this murder mystery, but there's a very unequal power balance between them. And I really like the way that Lay navigated that. I thought it was really well done. There's a lot of commentary in here about Nika being sort of like a child of the diaspora of her people. She no longer has that connection to her culture, which she didn't grow up with because she grew up in this country that they fled to. So it's this very interesting sort of part of her character that she has to figure out for herself. It's easy to sympathize with the struggles that she's having, so I really loved that element of it. And like I said, the magic and the steampunk setting were just really fun to explore. So I would definitely recommend this. I do think you have to have some enjoyment of YA fantasy. There are some elements in here, some of the angst that you tend to find more often in YA fantasy, so you have to have either enjoy that or have patience for it if it's not necessarily your thing. And I think the murder mystery is maybe not the strongest. I didn't have a hard time figuring out who was going to be responsible, but I also liked the characters in the setting enough that I didn't really care. So your mileage is probably going to vary on that one. But I ended up giving it 4 stars. It is a YA fantasy that works for me, and that I had a really great time with. Leg number 3 was The Capital from Panem and the Hunger Games. I really enjoyed the Hunger Games when those books came out, so it was fun to have that as one of the cities. And I originally had a different plan. I don't even remember at this point what I was going to pick up for this. The premise is an over-the-top cover. I mean, not the premise. The prompt was an over-the-top cover, and I couldn't help myself, but I picked up the sequel to The Last Bloodcarver, which was His Mortal Demise. Again, this is the very pretty Owl Crate edition, so I felt very safe in picking this one up as my over-the-top cover. And this one was a more complicated reading experience for me. It still ended up being 4 stars. And I don't really want to talk about a lot of the plot in here because Last Bloodcarver ends on a pretty substantial cliffhanger, and this book picks up immediately after. And it's sort of got this dual timeline element with more POVs that I thought was really interesting and really added to the tension for me. I really enjoyed the way that Leigh structured this novel. I think where it initially was a little more difficult for me is I didn't love one of the POVs as much as I loved Nika's POV in the first one. It didn't have quite as much snark, and it's a much more serious, much more dramatic person that made me think more of the things I like less, typically, in young adult fantasy, where it felt very dramatic, very angsty in a way that I don't always get along with. But I do like the way it expanded on the world, and you learned more about the culture that Nika comes from. And it really was very interesting to see the way that this series is a duology, so it's interesting to see Leigh tie everything together. I really liked that. So I would definitely still recommend this one. I think that this was also 4-star for me. I think it's a good series. I don't know that it's going to be a mind-blowing YA fantasy series for anybody, but if you want something that's steampunk, has a very interesting magic system, I think this is one that's well worth picking up. And I am super happy that I ended up really enjoying this duology. Because I binged a duology. Who am I? The person who always starts series and never finishes them. But it's very satisfying to have finished a duology. And I'm really glad that since I took a gamble and got both special editions for this, that I ended up enjoying it. So, yay! Leg 4 was Hobbiton, of course, Lord of the Rings. I think I have them behind me somewhere here. One of my favorite series, so I'm definitely not sad to see more of the Shire and the Hobbits. And the prompt for this one was to pick a cozy or a comfort read. This didn't have to be a cozy fantasy, just anything that made you feel comforted. And that's good, because I did not pick a cozy fantasy as someone who's not always getting along with cozy fantasy. But what I ended up picking up was A Curious Beginning by Deanna Raybourn, which is sort of like a historical mystery with sort of hints of a romance that I think is going to develop. This has been on my list for a while because I tend to really enjoy mysteries, especially historical mysteries. And I have somewhat mixed feelings on this one, to be honest. I feel like maybe it got hyped up too much, so I had too high of expectations going into it. Overall, I enjoyed it, but I definitely have some things I didn't enjoy as much. I did end up getting the first 3 books in this series this year from a friend, so I'll be interested to see if the future books will make a difference for me in terms of being more sold on the series. The story follows Veronica Speedwell, who is this butterfly collector who goes out on these expeditions to collect butterfly specimens for people who want to study them but don't necessarily want to go out and capture them. And it allows her to be involved in that sort of natural history, expeditionary role, even as a woman in, I want to say, 19th century England. So it sort of gives her some of that flexibility. She ends up getting involved in some sort of mysterious and dangerous circumstances after the death of her aunts. So that part was really interesting. I really liked Veronica quite a bit. She made me think of sort of the Lady Trent from like Memoirs of Lady Trent mold of heroine in sort of a historical, semi-scientific type story. And she's very no nonsense. She does not fit into the general mold for women of the time. And I struggled with that a little bit in that I like Veronica. She's very snarky and very quick with a comeback, which was very fun to read. But she also has some commentary about women in more traditionally feminine roles that I enjoyed a little bit less. It got a little bit not like other girls. And well, I get that as someone who grew up as a tomboy, grew up struggling with gender, like expectations. It's still kind of frustrating that she's having some snarky, less than kind comments about people that might be fitting into those roles better. So I just don't love that. But I think what really brought this down for me is I hate the resolution of the mystery. It's just one of those. The reveal on that feels so convenient, so over the top. I just really didn't like it at all. I loved Veronica, and Stoker is this guy that ends up helping her out as she's trying to figure out what's going on. I loved their banter. Their back and forth. He's frankly a bit of a jerk, but she pushes back enough that it's fun for me. It kind of made me think of that dynamic from like Half a Soul, where the male character is being very prickly and borderline mean, but the woman pushes back enough that I have a good time with it. So it's not quite like a bully romance necessarily, but there's a lot of back and forth that I enjoyed. But unfortunately, in a historical mystery, it matters a lot more to me that I like the mystery part of it. In the last Bloodcarver, it doesn't matter to me as much if I don't like the mystery, because the mystery is not the main appeal of the story. In that one, the appeal is the setting and the characters. And in this one, while I liked the characters, it wasn't enough to overcome not liking the way the mystery wrapped up. So that's kind of my mixed feelings on A Curious Beginning. I ended up giving it 3.5 stars, so obviously I didn't hate it. I just really didn't like plot elements of it, which is what brought it down to a lower rating for me. But I will be picking up other books in this series. I'll probably try and read the other 2 in this series by the end of this year so I can decide if I keep going or if it's maybe just not one that works well for me. But I have hopes that the future books in the series will work better for me. Leg number 5 is The Wall from Westeros. I will admit to this not necessarily being my favorite fantasy series ever, which I know is a hot take, but whatever. And for this, the prompt was a chilling cover or winter setting. And for that, before I get into what I picked for this one, I have to say, first of all, that there were certain special abilities that you could get over the course of the game that would allow you to basically do certain things, but one of the things you could do is swap out, like read whatever book you wanted, even if it didn't fit the prompt. So no going into what I'm about to say that I used one of these abilities because I didn't want to read any of the books I had that had a winter setting on them. I had kind of fallen behind on the legs for the readathon, and I wanted something short. So what I ended up picking up was Every Heart a Doorway by Seanan McGuire, which is the first book in the Wayward Children series. And I've had somewhat mixed luck with Seanan McGuire in the past. I've really enjoyed some of McGuire's books in the past, and also not enjoyed some of them, so I wasn't really sure what to expect going into this. I also don't usually like portal fantasy books because I just don't like, I want escapism, pure escapism, which Portal Fantasy is usually going back and forth between the real world and a magical world, so it doesn't always work as well for me. But that being said, I loved this. I had a great time. I think I devoured it in a single setting. It's a novella, so it's not exactly difficult, but I enjoyed this much more than I thought I would. I think almost everybody knows about the Wayward Children at this point, but in case you somehow have not heard about this series is a series of novellas following children who essentially have gone into a portal world and been kicked back out to our world for one reason or another. There is a boarding school that helps them readjust to the real world and figure out how to move on with their lives after them completely changing when they went to the Portal Fantasy world and then being stuck back in their old shoes. And in this one, the main character is Nancy, who was in this sort of world run by the Lord of Death, and really is struggling to adjust back to people who move and wear bright colors and aren't part of that world of death. And there ends up being sort of a murder mystery element as she gets to know the other kids at this boarding school. And man, I loved this so much. I really enjoyed the way that McGuire kind of set up the different types of portal worlds that these kids had been through. I was fascinated by the different options. I normally am not a big fan of any kind of info dump or learning about the magic via lessons for kids. That usually is an immediate no for me. But in this one, I was fascinated. I really liked learning along with Nancy. I am admittedly someone who's fascinated by death and skeletons and all of that. So that Nancy's world fit right into things that I find interesting. So that probably helped some. I loved what I got to see of these characters. I can't wait to see more of them, hopefully in the future novellas. So I really liked that. I was intrigued by where this mystery was going. It seems like that's sort of hit or miss for folks, but for me it worked really well. I was really interested to see what was going to happen with that, and it took me a little bit by surprise. So I am definitely looking forward to picking up the second one in this series. I have a bind up of the first 3, so this is another one that I expect to at least read the first 3 by the end of the year. And yeah, it's one of McGuire's stories that really works for me. If you are at all interested in fairy tales, I think that's maybe the other piece that makes this work really well for me, is that I love fairy tales and I love twists on fairy tales, and this has sort of that very similar feel to it. I'm really glad that this one lived up to the hype for me, and I'm very excited to continue. Leg 6 was Ketterdam in Kirch, which, if you're not familiar with it already, is part of the Six of Crows duology by Leigh Bardugo. I love that duology, so I was very excited to be in Ketterdam. And the prompt for this one was that it takes place in a large city. This one was a little bit of a risk for me because I ended up picking up Bury Your Gaze by Chuck Tingle. This was the first thing I'd ever picked up by Chuck Tingle, who I only knew for his bonkers erotica that I've never read. I just enjoy seeing the covers and the titles for those. But I thought this was really great. And I will admit that going into this, not only had I not tried anything by Chuck Tingle before, but it's heavily focused on Hollywood and queer horror. And I don't care about Hollywood at all. It's usually not my jam. So I was not sure how it would feel, both on an author level and on a plot level. The premise for this is essentially that the main character, Misha, has been writing scripts for various queer horror films and is now writing a TV show that features 2 sort of secret agent characters that he has been leading up to them revealing that they are gay and having this queer romance between them. And the studio execs decide that the best thing for the TV show is to kill the queer characters, Bury Your Gaze. And Misha refuses to do it because as a gay man, he has had to watch that happen in media as he's been growing up, and he's not having it. And of course, all kinds of scary things start happening to Misha, and he has to figure out what's going on and basically just try and survive. And honestly, it's a surprise how much I loved this. This was such an easy 5-star read for me. I had a great time with how campy it was. I loved that as Misha is seeing these various monsters that are stalking him, it's not only campy, but it also relates to his history. And I just loved getting to see these flashbacks of sort of what's inspired him as a writer of queer horror, and I really enjoyed the commentary on Hollywood and the ways in which they exploit queer identities but also don't allow them to have happy endings, and I thought that was really well done. I have seen people have mixed responses to this one as far as the way the plot resolves, but I had a great time with it. I would definitely, if you are at all interested in queer horror, you don't mind sort of on-the-nose themes, which admittedly I usually don't, but for whatever reason this worked for me. I would definitely recommend it, especially for fans of horror. I think it's really fun to see Chuck Tingle make arguments for why horror matters, and the way he ties all the identities into this horror story. So I absolutely adored it. And I'm glad that I finally picked up something from Chuck Tingle. I think I will be picking up any of his horror going forward. And in fact, I did in July, so you'll hear about that later. So for Leg 7, we got Camp Half-Blood, is a reference to the Percy Jackson series, which I read a very long time ago and enjoyed. I usually am not super into Greek myths, but that one was fun. I think I was a little too old for it, so I didn't get super sucked in, but I can see why people fully love it. And unfortunately, this is kind of where, after I had such bangers like all the way through the beginning of this race, the vast majority of it, Leg 7 is where things went a little downhill for me. I think I used another one of the card abilities so that I could pick up whatever I wanted, and I picked up something that I knew was going to be a little bit of a gamble, but it sounded like it could be a fun time. As again, I was at the end of this race here, the second half of the race, I was very much behind in trying to catch up. Picked up Of Monsters and Mainframes by Barbara Truelove, which is a brand new release, sci-fi elements, but also campy horror elements. And this one was a tough one for me because I feel like I always want to love stories about like AI and robots sort of figuring out their identities and forming their own relationships, because I love Murderbot. Murderbot is one of my favorite series ever. I just absolutely love sort of the way that series explores Murderbot figuring out what it wants out of life and figuring out how to have relationships with people while also dealing with its trauma. On the surface, I feel like this one should have worked for me. The premise for Of Monsters and Mainframes is that a ship AI, there's a AI on a spaceship who's basically in charge of running the whole ship and ferrying passengers from one planet to another. And there's also a medical robot that's on this that's responsible for taking care of the passengers, named Steward, I think. And they keep having passengers die. And so this medical robot and the AI kind of have to work together to figure out what's happening to their passengers. I think part of what didn't work for me in this one, and I ended up DNFing it at 52%. So I did try. I really tried with this one, and I just, man, what didn't work for me is that it's done in a series of voyages. So you kind of do these time skips as one crew of passengers gets all slaughtered by some monster, and then the AI and the medical robot have to try and figure out what's happening in the next round of passengers. And so I could never get attached to any of the characters because we were skipping around so much. This is not really focused on identity in the way that Murderbot is, and it started to have the feel to it that I got with Service Model from Adrian Tchaikovsky, which is very... Okay, I'm going to try and say this in a way that's not dismissive of Service Model, which I didn't love. It starts to feel a little precious and twee to me sometimes when you have robots, people exploring robots, but it's like... It starts to feel cutesy, and like they're not an actual robot character trying to figure out where they fit in. They're just like this representation of, oh, isn't that a cute robot? I'm not very good at explaining this, but it started to feel a little bit too much like that to me, where kind of this manufactured feel of robots, not an actual character, more like the themes and a found family where I wasn't really getting to know the characters at all. So that was off-putting for me. It got into the same thing that Service Model did, where Service Model started to feel repetitive because you have a robot who's stuck in these logic loops, and there's sort of a similar aspect to the conversations between the AI and the ship robot, where they're running into different logic and programming issues, that then it's the same thing over and over and over again. And I just really can't stand that level of repetition in a story. So it's sort of that mix of twee but also repetitive that just doesn't work for me. I think if you love cozy sci-fi and you're not as character driven as I am, then I could see this one working. I can see the kind of reader who would love Of Monsters and Mainframes. It's just not for me. But because I got to 52% for this DNF, I was able to count it for this leg. But it was a little unfortunate because I went in really hoping that this would be the sort of like sci-fi robot story that would work for me, and it just wasn't. Leg 8. We had the City of Night, Sivernage from The Crimes of Nyaxia, so Serpent in the Wings of Night and Ashes in the Star-Cursed King, which I really have grown to like. It's one of the few romantasy stories that does work for me. Not 100%, but enough that I had a good time with it. I'm giving a review of each of these cities as I go too, so I'm sorry, you're just getting all the thoughts. The book I initially picked up for this, so the prompt for this one is a book with low ratings that you think you'll still love. The book that I picked up for this, I feel a little bit bad about because it does have low ratings. I was a little skeptical going in because it is sort of a reimagining of Hamlet, which is not a Shakespeare play that's ever done anything for me personally. But one of my friends really enjoys this and has been trying to get me to read it, and I've been put off by the low ratings and the Shakespeare element. And unfortunately, it is one that doesn't work for me. And that is The Death I Gave Him by M.X. Liu. And the average rating for this one is a 3.36, and I think there are definitely people that this is going to work really well for, but it's one of those that's a very niche sci-fi that you have to like a certain subset of things to enjoy. The basic premise is that the main character, Hayden, is working with his dad on sort of this, I think it's like an immortality serum, and finds his dad dead in the lab and has to figure out what's going on. And I think it's interesting because of the way that it combines these sci-fi elements with a very familiar Hamlet story. And I really like the mixed media integration of it, because you're getting interviews. It starts out with getting commentary from someone in the future who has studied this whole situation that happened. So you get some of their commentary, you get mixed media from interviews and transcripts, and I like the way that's woven together. What does not work for me is the writing style. The writing style was a huge part of why this was an immediate no for me. I think I made it 50 pages, so 14% into this book. So obviously I did not give it super long. But it's one of those where like you can recognize when a writing style isn't going to work for you. The writing style that Liu uses for this is very descriptive. very sort of like dramatic turn of phrase that I just don't get along with. There's a lot of, I think there were like a lot of metaphors that just, so this is a mixed bag for me because Arkady Martine from a memory called Empire does this, but it works really well for my brain, but sometimes it just feels overwrought to me. And that was the case here. I didn't like the way it was written. And I think the other part that was challenging for me is that you have a very withdrawn perspective because you're seeing stuff happen with Hayden, but you're not, a lot of it is narrated by the ship AI Horatio that Hayden is working with, at least at the beginning. So it feels very distant and withdrawn from Hayden himself in a way that I found difficult to get along with. And it's also just very tense in a way that was starting to stress me out. So, like I said, I gave up at 50 pages. I can see where this would work really well for certain readers. I'm just unfortunately not one of those readers. So this was one of the books in June that just didn't work for me. Because I DNF'd that one so early on, and you had to get to 50% in order to be able to count it, I did another special ability swap and picked up a manga, which is A Cat from Our World and the Forgotten Witch by Hiro Kashiwabe. This was volume 1. I ended up picking up the first 2 volumes. The second one was for the end of the month, so I'll talk about that when I get to that leg. The premise for this is that there's a witch who essentially helped save the world and has now been forgotten and lives in the woods, but is occasionally pestered by bandits and other threatening figures. So she ends up trying to summon like a guardian beast and accidentally summons a cat from like modern day Japan. And it's sort of, but the cat is now enormous as part of this summoning. So it's not like a little baby cat, it's a giant cat. And I think you'll be able to see it from whatever picture I end up putting up here. And I think this was, so I tend to avoid cat manga because, while I have a cat and love my cat, I tend to not enjoy cat manga because it's hyper focused on just being in love with how adorable cats are. And ends up feeling kind of twee to me, which makes me feel like a heartless jerk. But it is what it is, I guess. So I did enjoy the cat itself in this story. I enjoyed the cat and the witch trying to figure out how to work with each other, because the cat is supposed to be protecting the witch, but the cat's a cat. It just wants to be lazy and eat food and sleep all day. So you have sort of that dynamic between them. And the story behind this, with the witch being forgotten in the woods and having gone on these adventures, but now no one remembers who she is, really made me think of I've only watched the first episode, but what I have seen of the Frieren anime, which I really liked. And I think that it's kind of to this manga's detriment that I liked Frieren so much, because this feels like a lesser version of it to me. And that's maybe not fair, but I just didn't get as into this as I think other readers will. I had a moment of recognition with this one. I ended up giving it 3 stars, but it was that recognition that I should just stop picking up cat manga. I've seen this highly recommended. I think Leandra from the TBR Zero really enjoys this series, and I can see why. I know she enjoys cat manga a lot more than I do, so I think it's just not the right fit for me. Number 9 was Chestnut Springs, which is from a romance series that I can't remember the name of. I'll put it here because I haven't read it. It's a cowboy romance series, and it's not really my jam. Well, I guess I haven't tried it, so I don't know. But I have not been tempted into my cowboy romance era, I'll say that much. But unsurprisingly, the prompt for this was it just needed to be a book that had a romance in it. It didn't have to be romance genre, but it had to have some kind of romantic element. And what I ended up picking up is The Maid and the Crocodile by Jordan Ifueko. This is related to Ifueko's Raybourn duology. It's listed as a standalone fantasy romance. I would deeply disagree with the standalone part of that. I don't think you should pick up The Maid and the Crocodile if you have not picked up the duology. Not only because it reveals, since it's set after that duology, it reveals parts of the world that are kind of set up in Raybourn, but also because there's a narrative element that makes no sense if you haven't read Raybourn. So I would definitely recommend reading Raybourn first. I loved that duology, so this is probably the book I was the most excited to pick up in June, and I had to wait all month for this leg to come up because I knew this was the leg I wanted to use it for. So I was very impatient to get to this. It completely lived up to my expectations. The premise for this one is that it follows Small Sade, who is a orphan who has basically been trained as a maid and what's called a curse eater, in that she can get rid of sort of the weight of guilt for things that people have done by consuming it herself, but it also causes problems for her in the course of doing that. And so she's just trying to get a job as a maid, ends up having to find work as a curse eater because she is disabled and looks different from other people, so no one wants to hire her as just a maid, but as soon as they figure out she's a curse eater, that's where she finds a job. I love the way that Ifueko navigated sort of those class differences. I think that Ifueko does such an amazing job of having a story that feels like an older edge, the older edge of young adult, but is still so approachable on these very serious themes, and I love the way she explores those. In this case, like I said, there's some classism, there's also sort of the physical differences that Small Sade has to deal with, people not always accepting her, and she ends up accidentally tying herself up with this crocodile god, which is the romance part of it, and I had such a good time with that. Again, deeply connected to Raybourn, and I think it's really, really well done. I appreciate the way it talks about revolution and who benefits and who is left behind in the course of that revolution. I just think that Ifueko did such a great job of not dumbing that kind of stuff down, which I really like to see in a story aimed at a teenage audience. I think that was just fantastic. I also think that it's extremely readable as an adult. I'm in my late 30s and I had a great time with it. So I think not everybody is going to want to pick up a YA book, but if you want a YA fantasy that has interesting magic, very fascinating characters, and great thematic explorations, I think this is one of my favorites ever, really. So it's one I would highly recommend. We are finally to the last leg, leg 10, which was Wonderland, Down the Rabbit Hole. It was just a book that's shorter than the last book you read. This, as I mentioned earlier, I picked up the second volume of Cat from Our World and the Forgotten Witch, and I think maybe liked this slightly more than the first one. It's darker than the first one, which had maybe some dark elements, but this one definitely gets more into the politics that have led to the witch being forgotten, and not just forgotten, but not treated very well. And the cat really has to start protecting the witch from some of the politics that would otherwise lead to her being in pretty serious trouble. The one thing I will say for this manga that worked really well for me is there's a dynamic between an assassin who gets sent after the witch and the cat that's just very funny. I thoroughly enjoyed that dynamic. I think a lot of the darker elements that get introduced here feel a little gratuitous to me. Like, it's got it almost like the author felt like they had to balance out sort of the twee cute elements, and it just mostly didn't work for me. Like I said, I enjoyed that dynamic between the cat and one of the assassins, but that's really the only part that kept me going through it. That, and it's a super short read. So this was the point where I basically decided this series just isn't for me. I love it for all the people that get hyped with it and really enjoy the cat, but it's just a little bit not my wheelhouse. So if you are a cat lover and you like sort of like cute, cozy, but also sometimes dark stuff, this is definitely a manga that I would at least give a shot. I think overall, my reading month for the Amazing Readathon was a bit of a roller coaster, some really high highs and some lows and DNFs, unfortunately. But I ended up reading 9 books over the course of the readathon. Is 9 right? I read 1 for every... Oh, yeah, and I had the DNFs, and one of them actually counted for a prompt, so don't mind me, I can't count. But let me know if you have read any of the books that I have talked about. Let me know if you read any amazing books in June that I should know about. I guess if you want to just leave me an emoji to say that you were here, leave me a cat for my final read of the month, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye!